let me go ahead and get started, okay? I want to welcome everybody to the first ever webinar that we've produced by the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center. And I'm very delighted to be here with great panelists to talk about the whole topic of whether there have to be different models for entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley than in other places, especially in Asia. One of the things I'd like to point out is because we have a lot of people and we're getting used to how this is working, we'd like to ask you to use the Q&A mark down at the bottom of your screen if you have a question. Avoid the raise hands function this time, and also avoid chat. We'll just do questions from the audience by means of Q&A. I'll monitor that and make sure to relay your questions to the people on the panel. So this is Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford, have done this for a long time. And I'm here with, in alphabetical order, Professor Robert Eberhart, who is a visiting assistant professor in the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Bob and I have known each other for a long time. We won't get into that. But Bob, for a number of years, ran a very successful project called Stage, which was all about entrepreneurship in Japan. And before he came back to take an academic path to his career, Bob has experience starting a company and taking it to exit in Japan, and he's also got large company experience as a manager in Japan. So we're very happy that Bob's here with us. Over at the next alphabetically is David Lee, and David and I have also known each other for quite some time. David was one of the first 200 employees inside this little company now known as Google, and he really developed Asia Pacific for Google. After Google's success, he became an angel investor, and more recently has become a partner with venture capital firms. He's an advisor to a student group that we both think very highly of, the ACES, Asia Pacific Student Entrepreneurship Society at Stanford. And David and I first got to know each other when he was the driving force behind one of the first business accelerators in Seoul, Korea. This was K-Startup, and it had received support from not only Google, but also SK Planet and a number of other stakeholders. So David and I have known each other a while. David, welcome in.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
And our third panelist is Professor Ed Rubesh, and I've known Ed as a member of the research in Roundtable for Entrepreneur Education, which was an international association of faculty who are focusing on entrepreneurship. He started 2 entrepreneurship education programs at different universities in Thailand. He is currently in charge of a major program on innovation and entrepreneurship at the, what's the right term? University of Thailand Chamber of Commerce, UTCC?
The Thai Chamber of Commerce, that's correct, yes.
Okay, and Ed also has started at least 4 companies in Bangkok, and finally has gotten out of that. You've removed yourself from the companies as of last year, I think, right?
Yeah, just finished in November, we closed. That's
okay.
Good timing.
So I'm really happy that everyone would come in and join us for this. To get right into what we're talking about today, I want to kind of ask the question about what is the Silicon Valley model of entrepreneurship? And in a word, with this one slide, I would just point out that the kind of common obsession in Silicon Valley is to increase the value of company stock as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So after a company is founded, typically with friends and family money, like happens everywhere, at an early stage, the founders will sell off, 10 to 25% of the company to angel investors. And then for the next stage, the growth stage, they really have to get into venture capital where they have a sellable prototype. Eventually, the venture capitalists are going to take between 1/3 and a half of the company. And as this process repeats, everybody, the entrepreneurs, the investors, and all the employees, because most of them have stock options, are really looking to maximize the value of the company at the time of exit. And in Silicon Valley, about 9 companies exit successfully by being bought by a big firm, as exit by going IPO. Throughout the whole US, probably 50 or 60 venture-backed companies exit by IPO each year. So this is kind of the situation where gradually you see the ownership shift away from founders to investors. Now, there are all kinds of games that people play. Owner founders can separate voting stock from non-voting stock and maintain a control over the company by selling off non-voting stock to larger and larger numbers of people. But a specific example of this, if you look at Square, which is doing pretty well these days as a payment processing system for mobile payments that uses regular credit cards. It was founded back in 2009. We don't know how much money the entrepreneurs put into it, but Jack Dorsey, the founder and at the time ex-CEO of Twitter, um, probably had quite a bit to put in. Their first publicly announced funding was Series A venture capital, which in the year 2009 was an awful lot of money. You'll see that they raised huge amounts of venture capital, but they are growing at a breakneck pace. Between 3 years or 4 years after they first started up, they already had 400 employees. This is an exponential curve. Square, interestingly enough, when they finally went IPO, uh, the later stage investors lost money because their market cap, the share per price share, was about half of what the Series D and E stage investors had put in. But if you stuck with the company, their current value of stock is somewhere around $45 a share. And before all of the COVID-19 problem, it was really up in the 60s and 70s. So that's the Silicon Valley kind of model. Now, huge amount of variation. I'd like to just quickly go through the panel and ask how you see what you would say is the Silicon Valley model. Does that kind of fit what you're used to, or what would you like to say to expand on that? Bob, why don't you go first?
I have to unmute, sorry. Thanks a lot for asking me. It is what we call the standard model entrepreneurial studies, and it's very much focused on the investor and the shareholder, when most entrepreneurship is about the entrepreneur, which is a different story. The truth of the matter is, even in the United States, only about 9% of all successful companies that either exit or go IPO are funded by VCs. And what we also are finding is that as far as the motivation to start companies, very few companies start deliberately, where some people sit down in a garage and or in their apartment and say, usually it develops what we call effectually. Somebody is doing a hobby or something they like to do, and people like it, and then other people join with it. It kind of accumulates. And then it occurs to somebody, maybe we should get some financing, and then it goes in very different directions. So the only thing I would add is that this is true in many cases where people sit down to deliberately create a company. But it's also probably not true in maybe about 60% of the startups in Silicon Valley, and certainly around the rest of the United States. You're muted, Richard.
I just muted myself.
Yeah.
Bob, let me ask you to go on
Yeah.
and talk a little bit about Japan. Why don't I ask you to say how you saw the situation in Japan? What was
Do you want me
the
to do
same or
my
different?
is this my longer
Sure.
talk? Do you want the PowerPoint now or do you want it
I think
later?
now would be a great time. Why don't you do that?
Great. Well, let me just go through this really quick then if it works out. And I don't want to waste. I hope can anybody see this yet?
I'm seeing your
Yeah.
power.
Oh, good, good, good. I'm glad. You never knows. Anyway, Silicon Valley just, has this large impact, and we're not going to spend time on this, but I do want to make a point when we look across the world that Silicon Valley also has all kinds of problems. The startup rate in Silicon Valley is the lowest in the metropolitan regions of the United States, and that's been true since the 90s. We don't have a high amount of startups here in Silicon Valley. And also there's almost no social safety net for people who are entrepreneurs here. If you fail as an entrepreneur, you're failing bad. And in other countries, there's at least you won't lose you will have health insurance, basic income. Inequality is a fast growing problem here. And, the gig economy has created new forms of actually terrible grinding poverty. And the real problem here is that talent is moving out and can't afford to move in. In Palo Alto, where I live, for example, physicians cannot afford a house, never mind nascent entrepreneurs or young technical workers. So we're having all that problem. And also what's emerged here in Silicon Valley is kind of a series of 4 monopolistic giants, not a bunch of entrepreneurial firms. And so it's a different economy. And I think this comes from misunderstandings maybe about Silicon Valley and what's going on here. You can see this business tax climate in the United States. You can see where the taxes are highest on the Northeast coast, the West Coast, and the upper Midwest. You can see where property taxes are highest in the same place. You also see, and that's where regulations are the worst too. But interesting enough, that's where the high technology companies form. High technology companies form in high tax, high regulated environments. We're not saying they need them, but it means we don't really understand entrepreneurship well yet. It's clear that entrepreneurship and age is important. The average age of a successful entrepreneur here in Silicon Valley is 40 years old. Twice as many entrepreneurs over 50 are successful as under 35. People over 55 are 3 times more likely to found a successful company than those between 20 and 34. And so you get this whole idea that we don't particularly understand. And so when we look at innovation, for example, here in Silicon Valley, we're proud of our innovation, but look at the innovation in the United States broadly around 1900. You have the sewing machine, the telephone, mouse traps, movie cameras, smoke detectors, microphones, movie cameras, remote controls, computers, building air conditioning, radio, airplanes, rockets, cars, electric lights. That was an incredibly innovative era. And so we wonder about the focus on Silicon Valley very, very much. And we think it has to do with our age. We've been here for a long, long time. And it developed because it was difficult to travel here. And it developed the technologies from communication and machinery through the 60s, through the 40s, where it was war technology, to the 60s, where it developed with semiconductors, and to the 80s and 90s, where it became machines and connected machines. So Silicon Valley, the point of all this, has evolved in a straight line, not from some inspired group of people or anything. It's about it's a historical development, but we perceive it this way. We see it as the kind of a special place that's specially endowed with character. And so that brings us to Japan, and I'll just take a couple minutes on this. And why is Japan felt to be so different? And maybe its beliefs there, and did it not have the same advantages or same conditions as Silicon Valley? We can look at where the new companies are forming in Japan. Companies in Japan tend to form where people live. This is the distribution of population is the same as where companies live. New technology firms, though, in Japan form in Tokyo. That's quite different than the United States, where technology firms do not form in New York. There's some do, but we're the center and we're distant from New York. New Japanese technology firms that form, you can see it's dominated by the software industry. Usually custom software and some packaged software and some telephony. And so it's very much in the software and telephone businesses that Japan tech firms are forming. Some of them are exiting with decent amount of sales, but the largest ones are in semiconductor industry, printed circuit manufacturing, electronics manufacturing. And that seems clear to come from just the conditions in Japan, where you can see that over the past 30, 40 years, it's the capital equipment that has become the dominant export of Japan, not cars and electronics. And so the industries that entrepreneurs are forming in Japan are there to form the particular trade dynamic in Japan now. It's the same point as Silicon Valley, where I went through those slides before. Silicon Valley formed because of its local conditions, and Japan's entrepreneurship is shaped to its own local conditions. Japanese entrepreneurs are mostly male, sadly. The new company CEOs are about 40 years old. That's about the same here in Silicon Valley. This is the same thing, really. The CEO in Japan is usually the founder, and that's different than the United States in a venture capital funded firm anyway. And these are the universities where Japanese entrepreneurs graduate from, and this is equalized for their enrollment. And you can see it's the large universities, Chuo and Waseda, and business universities, but you can see some of the highest ones are small technical universities where entrepreneurs are coming from in Japan. It's sort of what you would expect for a technical thing. By the way, the idea that it takes a particular university to create entrepreneurship is probably not true. The entrepreneurship is going to happen in any city, and in any city there is a university. So, it's probably just false attribution. The other thing that we noticed pretty interesting is that the rise of technology in terms of patents and grouping in Asia. I saw these slides in a presentation about 4 years ago, and you can see that it doesn't include Japan, and I wondered why. I said, why isn't Japan in this? So a friend of mine and I put Japan in it, and this is what it looks like when you put Japan in. And these are the number of percent of US patents over here, and these are over the years. And I thought, well, maybe there's industry effects. So in biotechnology, Japan is clearly dominating, in nanotechnology, in ICT. And I thought surely in the solar industry, I've heard that China is leading there. Well, apparently not. Japan has done a great job. So Japan clearly is leading in terms of patents and technology. So I'll finish with why is the narrative so negative in Japan? Well, first of all, this whole idea of the new firms. The US has about 775,000 firms a year. Japan has about 220. So there's a lot of gnashing of teeth that Japan is so much smaller, but you got to remember that Japan is 1/3 the size of the US. And if we make up Japan's rate by 2/3 to make it equivalent on a population scale, it looks like that. So the calculations come out this way. US starts at this much, Japan starts at this much, but the total number of US firms is about 6.5 million firms, meaning that the US startup rate's 10%. You take the 6.5 million divided by 700,000 starts. Japan's starts are 200,000, but there's 4 million Japanese firms. The reason is you can't close Japanese companies. You can get into that later in question A if you want. And that means the Japan rate they measure is only 3%. But if the starts was the same as the US, if you just adjust it for population, Japan would have the same startup rate. So I'll close there. I'm just saying that Japan is trying to emulate Silicon Valley, but that's a mistake because it's developing companies that are set to its own particular context. Its startup rate is not any different than the United States. And it needs to focus on, I think, more or less worrying about the United States, and it should more worry about Japan.
Okay, thanks, Bob. If I can kind of, make sure we keep the focus on what might be considered models of entrepreneurship. So you're saying Japan's trying to emulate the Silicon Valley model,
right?
But I assume that you mean that kind of standard model that I pointed out, even though you in your presentation have pointed out that that's not as widely applicable as it looks.
Well,
right?
I think that's exactly right. And to be real brief, Japan, for example, Japanese people often come over, as you know well, wondering how to energize their venture capital firms. But in
Yeah.
Japan, alternative financing is much more attractive. You can get, I don't know if it's still true today, but certainly when I was there, you could get a loan from a bank for 20 years at 1%. And I'd much rather have that than give up a third of my company to a VC. And so most smart Japanese entrepreneurs. VCs are a very small part of the
Now,
Japanese
of course,
economy.
we could talk about this because hopefully people go to angels not only for the money, but for the advice that they can get and so
Well,
forth.
exactly right.
But
So,
I want to ask one kind of follow-up to you before we go
yeah,
on and then really move around into a
yeah, I
discussion.
understand, yeah.
The follow-up is, so how has Silicon Valley maintained the standard model as sort of the way everybody thinks about the Valley for so long? This has been going on at least since the early 1990s and really accelerated, in the run up to the dot-com boom, where people really tend to think that that's the way that, entrepreneurship is supposed to work, or that Silicon Valley works.
We have
How is it? I mean, what is it? Who's in charge of the publicity for the Valley?
we have studied that, and there's two things that are going on. Silicon Valley became in the 90s an exemplar of rapid wealth accumulation and development of particular style of technology companies. It happens very much, and this has happened over and over in history, where people look at the successful time, compare it to their own places, and try to copy it. So, for example, just to keep it in Japan, in the 1860s, Japanese sent experts to the United States to learn how to develop their industry and their industrial power, and they sent that group to Cleveland because that was what was happening at the time. Now, Japan doesn't look in any way like Cleveland, but we often copy what we think are successful. And so when people come to Silicon Valley, they look at what's going on and they say, oh, what's happening is these are companies we want to have. How do we get them? Well, look, there's all these venture capital firms. What they're not paying attention to is venture capital firms are about the last thing to develop here. There was entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley long before anybody had heard the word venture capital. And the various structures and the connection to the trade routes and the connections to the various technologies and the reasons technology developed here had nothing to do with venture capital. So
Yeah, okay.
it's interesting people make a mistake by looking at the end of the process rather than looking and copying the beginning of the process. And that's how that belief's embedded.
Got it. Okay, so basically we've got a couple of questions that have come in, but if you don't mind, I'd like to move on and ask for our other panelists to give comments, and then we'll come back to those questions because the discussion does not depend on those questions right now. We can come back to them in a little bit. So please just wait for a few minutes for us to get back. Ed, are you ready to talk a little bit about how the situation compares in Thailand?
Yes, I am. Let me see if I can get some slides up here. I think this will work. All right. Before I get going, first of all, I want to kind of build on a couple of points that Bob made right at the end, because I think they're also very applicable to our situation in Thailand and I'll say Southeast Asia. Thailand isn't as big as Japan or as big as the US, but when you put it in the context of Southeast Asia, the region becomes also quite significant. But I'm a big believer as well that, and this is going to be kind of the end message in a few minutes, that we would do a lot better if we were focused on solving problems in the region, building businesses around those, and implementing technologies that work. And in fact, then some of those companies would grow to become global dominating companies. And the reason that breaks down is for the last point that Bob made, and that is, and this drives me crazy, people go on to a place like Stanford, MIT, whatever, and see the shiny buildings, and even these days the labs are all shiny as well, right? And that's gives this false impression of what research is, because you can go to these labs with nice windows now. I graduated from MIT, and MIT had a lot of closed cement buildings, and now they've cut all the walls down so you can look in the glass, and it's, you know, people walk down the halls, look in the glass, and it looks nice and clean and gleaming, but the research process is still a frustrating process of working through things. And when you see research looking nice and gleaming like that with polished displays on the front of the lab or something, it kind of sets the wrong impression of what it takes to really bring an innovation out and succeed. And I'll now throw in a couple of disclaimers. I'm less interested in building businesses. I mean, I love the innovation process, and I view entrepreneurship as a mechanism for getting innovations out into the world. So that's really my bias, for better or worse, that I'm going to bring out here. And the other thing I should probably say is my views here don't necessarily represent the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce or even Thailand. And I don't say that as a legal disclaimer. It's just a fact. There's probably only a handful of people who may even agree with what I'm about to say. But nonetheless, I'm hoping that the people we're working together in our groups are stretching the front end of what entrepreneurship can be in the region. So with that in mind, I'll just give a quick introduction. I've been in Thailand 28 years, and so I've kind of, and at the time when I got involved with entrepreneurship development, I'll put this slide up here. Doesn't seem like my, okay. You know, two of the major things that have really affected the way I'm viewing things in Southeast Asia is I got involved with entrepreneurship development around 2000, and it really wasn't a trend then. In fact, it was an anti-trend, because for the same reasons Bob was just talking about, entrepreneurship was collapsing everywhere. It was the dot-com, you know, the internet was looked at as not as cool as it was a few years ago before that. And I got involved with technology licensing and trying to build entrepreneurship really from the ground up. And that's the process I understand, even though I bump up against policy people and end up in a lot of policy meetings these days. I understand kind of more of a ground up, you know, approach from the ground up. So again, those are my biases and the lenses I look through in the work that I do. So skipping through here. Okay. So I'll give a quick introduction to Thailand as an entrepreneurial opportunity. And I want to emphasize, this is the view of Thailand from the startup ecosystem point of view. Now, what I mean by that is, for me, this by no means represents the entrepreneurial innovation things that are going on, but this is the high profile community. This is the one that's trying to act like Silicon Valley. So let's walk through this one first. These are cumulative numbers, but going through 2017, I looked at 2018, actually dropped down. So 2018 dropped down a little bit over 2017. So I didn't really add the data here, but you know, 90 funded startups. Again, this is funded startups in what would be called the technology ecosystem. And at the time, this is cumulative over 6 or 7 years, you know, probably just around $300 million. The biggest round up through 2000, even through 2018, like I said, it dipped down, was about $65 million, total about 300 million. So we're talking about a lot smaller numbers when we're comparing things to bigger regions like Japan or the United States. But more importantly, for the message here is, I want to show people the kinds of startups that are popping up, because I also am very keen to make the comparison that Bob did about the types of companies, because if we're going back to Richard's question, the Silicon Valley model is skewed to a very, very narrow type of business. And today it's software. Really, if you look at the Price Waterhouse Money Tree reports that come out every year, the top 4 things, if I recall correctly, okay, one of them is biotech. You can slide biotech in. But outside of that, it's software and entertainment, which is essentially another form of software. And you see the same kind of thing here. You know, e-commerce is the biggest part of the action. FinTech, which is basically e-commerce for banks. And then you get a lot of logistics and payment. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this, in my opinion. First of all, Thailand is excellent retailing. In fact, I would say Thailand is better at retailing than the United States. At retailing in all sectors. I mean, retailing in terms of shopping malls, hotels. There's a lot of retail sectors where I would say Thailand does an excellent job. Now, a lot of those sectors are viewed as, say, more traditional businesses or more traditional industries. But I think these numbers reflect the fact that those industries are trying to figure out how to stay relevant in a more connected world. They've seen the Amazons come up and the Rakutens and the things that are a threat to the traditional retail industries. And for that reason, I think that's driving a lot of this activity. A lot of the funding in these deals are corporate VCs. So Richard was asking earlier about the place I'm at. I'm at something called the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce. It's a university that's just over 50 years old. It was started by the business grouping of the largest companies in Thailand. So one of the reasons I made the move there for a couple of reasons. One was the president of the university at the time, a very, very energetic, hard-driving person, had wanted to set up this relationship with MIT. Through some mutual friends, she found me, kind of an MIT grad doing some stuff in Bangkok already, and I enjoyed her vision and her enthusiasm, and so I came and joined them. And the second thing was to be more directly tied into this grouping of large companies who have some innovation desires and probably some innovation needs, and then to see how entrepreneurial driven innovation might help. So these numbers here, and a lot of the technology startup ecosystem is driven by some sort of corporate venture capital. I'm driven by something else. So I think those big companies are going to succeed either way, but I still look around this region, and this is where I have to admit I'm in a very small number of people at the moment, but I think we're growing our numbers. And Richard, this builds on ideas that I've floated in front of your class over several years, when I've had a chance to come and see you and your students. But I still am a big believer that entrepreneurship can be deployed to fill in the gaps of fuzzy and messy problems. And that characterizes Southeast Asia. So Steve Blank happened to be traveling through a year ago. He and I and his wife kind of did a pleasure trip. This had nothing to do with business of any sort, but he went up to Chiang Mai, and then I took him to Laos, and we went to Cambodia and stuff like that. And when we were there, we had a lot of chance to talk. And I explained to him, what I consider this missing gap, that there is this Thailand startup ecosystem, which I just shared with you guys. A lot of it's aligned around retail and the needs of big companies to innovate into these new spaces. And that I saw this gap of these other needs, which are all of these problems across the region. Let's call them things that are related to education or delivering healthcare to rural areas, different agricultural type innovations. And of course, Steve said, hacking for regional innovation. So, he does hacking for defense and hacking for state. And he was saying, let's do this hacking for regional innovation. So I want to share, this is what I consider, what I'm hoping to drive kind of the vanguard or the front end of what we can be doing with entrepreneurial driven innovation. And I just got a couple of slides, so I'll just give it in kind of an overview. I think the details are less important, but what I do see is what I've just kind of been saying, and a little bit kind of continuing with what Bob was saying. Now there is this startup community, or this startup, these set of startup activities which are promoted by governments, and they're fueled by young people, many who have gone overseas to study and come back home, and many others who read about it on the internet. And so in the big cities, Bangkok, Phnom Penh, Ho Chi Minh, Yangon, you're going to see a very similar set of startups, the mini versions of the Airbnbs, the food deliveries, the mobile payments, the city delivery services. And that's great. Go ahead and work on that. But where I see the the missing piece is there's no scale. I think people are looking at creating the entrepreneurial version for their city and maybe some of the bigger regional cities in their country, but not really thinking beyond that. So that the hypothesis I'm having is that there's a group of people, there are other people across the region, and these people do exist. They live in the provincial cities. Many of them come from traditional families, big business families that are spread out across Thailand and Myanmar and Cambodia and Vietnam. And they've got a new generation coming up through the business who isn't as excited about running the traditional businesses in the provincial capital. I see them as potentially really being closer to the big challenges across the region, and yet having the sophistication of knowing what's going on elsewhere and trying to suggest this could be, this is what we're working towards in the activities that I run to try to create a step that moves forward, maybe away from what you're calling the traditional Silicon Valley model, but still using entrepreneurial drive and entrepreneurial ambition to bring some of these technologies out across the region, outside the big cities. The big cities will adopt all the stuff that's going on in San Francisco and Boston anyway, but I see a huge region. We can build it on a lean startup methodology, but most importantly, we can kind of use that entrepreneur as a bridge between some of the technologies that are coming out of the universities and the engineering schools that are trying to develop things for the developing world, but also bring it together with researchers and stuff in the region. By the way, I doubt anyone there knows this, but CLMVT is what Thailand calls the region of neighboring countries. So it's Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Thailand. So this region is ripe and very much in need of another wave of entrepreneurship to bring some innovations into it. And I hope we're able to do that and maybe get away from staring so fixedly on the Silicon Valley that gets people so excited about the Ubers and the WeWorks and the Juiceros and all of these things. So that's kind of, I wanted to kind of give a short overview of where we are in Thailand. It really echoes a lot of what Bob was already saying. So this is where I see as the phase that we're trying to push forward in trying to kind of change the way entrepreneurship is being done. I'll just add one last thing, and then I'll open up to David. But I do see so the entrepreneur, there are these high-profile entrepreneurs that go to the startup ecosystem stuff. They go to the pitches. They go to Startup Thailand, and again, these are true in all the cities. But there is also a generation of upcountry business families, and a different generation, same age actually, but I look at them as a different group, of kind of the first generation of college-educated kids from these rural areas. And this is really the target that I see as being able to open up entrepreneurial kind of ambition. I'm a little bit more motivated and a little bit more inspired by kind of the Steve Case activities. I can't remember his program, but Steve Case is setting up that program to find and develop entrepreneurship across the middle of the U.S. I forgot what the program's called, but you guys probably know what, you probably heard of it. But those kind of things, I mean, there's a lot of people who want to do something new and different, and they sit a lot closer to the challenges. And so they're ideal, I think, to be developing this. And then my last point here is, not only do they exist in Thailand, but they really exist across the region, this young generation that's itching to do something. And so that's kind of where we're going with our activities. So yes, there's a startup ecosystem which kind of mimics what's going on in Silicon Valley, but I hope that we are on the right track to developing a different kind of entrepreneur that's really focused on the challenges of the region.
Okay, thanks, Ed. David, before we talk with you, there's one of the questions that's come up, and I think that both you and Bob, it'd be great if you comment on this question. And this is why entrepreneurs in these other regions, many of them don't have the kind of global perspective that people do here in the Valley. I mean, it's really true that if you don't have a business that can scale up to global size, you're probably not going to get money here in the Valley. That's one thing. But do you think it's the influence of the investors, or is it just lack of kind of international awareness? Bob, what do you see about what you've seen in Japan?
Thanks. Well, I just don't see that. I was watching last night 3 advertisements alone on this Hulu show I was watching for Rakuten, as they called it. I remember when my friend Hiroshi Mikitani started that in 1990. And he started globally in the second year, I think. My friend Jun Kinobuchi started Wavelock, which is a cell phone tops for Samsung phones, set up factories in China and Kazakhstan and Vietnam, set up design centers in the United States and Japan. So
Okay, so your
I
point
just
is
don't
that
see that
Japanese
at all. No.
entrepreneurs do have global focus.
And I think I would love to see any evidence to say that they don't. It just seems pejorative to say, why aren't they thinking the way I am? Well, I don't know. Their companies are successful.
Yeah, but there's a relative small number of them.
I wouldn't
You
think
do see a
so.
lot of startups that seem to kind of top out when they kind of get a good profit going in their home
I
markets.
just don't know if that's true in Japan. I don't know about Thailand, and I'm sure Richard has a better view. But I think in Japan, in particular, we see a great deal. Sony Ericsson, they're on a big company basis. You know, a lot of people think that when a Japanese company becomes big and international, it stops being Japanese. And that's certainly the case in Rakuten right now. And it's hard for us to think, if you think hard about name. It's easy to think of Japanese companies that are here in the Valley operating. It's hard to think of any other country, maybe except Germany and Canada.
Well, I have to say I'm seeing a lot from other places as well.
No, you're right. I
The
agree with
Europeans are
you.
pretty active here, and so are
That's true.
China companies and
Yeah,
Hong
China,
Kong companies and
I
so
love
forth,
China.
right?
That's right. Yeah.
But Ed, what do you think is the real reason why entrepreneurs in the CLMVT are not thinking more globally? You do have startups beginning in places like Indonesia. I'm thinking of Gojek and like Grab coming out of Singapore that really did aim for a much bigger world market early.
Yeah, first of all, Grab came out of Malaysia. And
Thanks.
well, the only reason I pick on that, not to quibble with you, Richard, but to really emphasize anybody who's been to Malaysia, and Malaysians know this, the taxis are terrible there in terms of their willingness to, or were terrible in their willingness to respond. Grab was a great example of somebody solving a local problem first and growing it. So the more that we can get that mentality across, the more we're going to have an opportunity to be creating regional scale or global scale businesses. But I think the other issue is simply selection bias. And that is because Silicon Valley is, has become such a magnet, it's going to attract everyone from around the world. It's not the only magnet these days, but it's still a formidable magnet. So it's going to attract people from around the world who have that desire to build that kind of a business. To the point where, if I was going to add a couple more slides to Bob's list of Silicon Valley evils, I would say that the venture capital model has moved beyond where it was 10 or 15 years ago, and today it can be cynically looked at as a game to grab money. Let's look at a WeWork, for example. That I don't know what was in, the founder's mind. Did he really believe he was changing the world, or did he feel that if I can convince enough people to buy this from the public money, so the public money is funding a lot of these big global stories. And it's true, I don't know anyone in this region who's going to spin that kind of a story. But I do think that there are people who are thinking regionally, and then once something is successful regionally, it will grow. So I think there's some selection bias. I would also say that there is a tendency for the people who are, let's say, in the startup communities, the so-called technology startup communities across the region. I see this in Singapore, I see this in Bangkok, I see this in Ho Chi Minh. They've had access to an overseas education. That means they've come from a pretty comfortable background. And that means they don't necessarily have the full fire, I guess, to get through a lot of the real challenges of solving the problems that you need to really build a business. And it's a little easier to kind of do the rounds on the panel discussions at various startup activities than it is to really be there on a daily basis fighting the fires that you need to build a company. So there's some selection bias. I think there are entrepreneurs in the region that are thinking bigger. They don't show up on the startup Thailand radar necessarily, but I hope we're going to change that.
Real quick question. What about language? Are you getting a lot of Thai companies that start out with English language services early so that they can expand easier outside the country?
Well, yes and no. So this is an interesting topic. So part of that presentation I gave came from a presentation I gave in Japan a few months ago. And one of the reasons I was giving that presentation the way it was is a lot of that money that's come in, some of it's corporate from Thailand, but some of it's people like Rakuten who want the Thai language. They're investing in Thailand to get the Thai language version of books and stuff like that. And they're investing similarly in Indonesia to get the Indonesian version or the Bahasa version. So there is money flowing in from people like the Rakutens as well. And so in those cases, the entrepreneur's strength is their language, but unfortunately, they will be part of a much bigger company rather than, building their business from a startup.
Okay, I want to move on, and I want to give David a chance to comment about the kind of regions that you focused on and what you see, especially from the standpoint of being an investor in this kind of a situation, working with a lot of entrepreneurs in this part of the world. David, if you would,
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, I mean, for me, I didn't really start working with or investing in startups, working with entrepreneurs until leaving Google. And it really just came out of the notion of helping other ex-Googler who'd left to get their ideas off the ground. And so there's no capital gain motivation. I wasn't going to be an investor. But when one of them got acquired by Facebook, I started seeing this realization of, the Valley is really bred and it's made, the whole ecosystem is made to support entrepreneurs. And it's been that way. That there's the trust, there's this, I don't want to call it goodwill, but there's this goodwill of wanting to help each other out to make their businesses better. And that notion, I think, is very cultural, that you might not see, or we didn't see before, at least in other countries, especially in Korea. I think at that time, things were still getting off the ground in terms of startups. And so from that, what evolved from there was starting this fund with some other ex-Googlers, putting our own money into it. Just small pieces of investment that we're putting into other guys that we knew. But then I started seeing a trend of entrepreneurs coming from Korea that were looking to the Valley for investors, because most of the guys, as you probably know, very similar to maybe Japan and other countries, had very stringent rules around getting investment. I'll get a little bit more into that. But as a result, SK Telecom then came to the Valley, which is the largest mobile carrier in Korea. They had a $100 million CVC fund, which I co-led with someone else, and really formally started looking at ways to find great technologies that we could bring back or somehow work together on or collaborate with, and which gave me more insight into how Asian companies view US companies and how to work with them, and then launching K Startup, as you mentioned earlier, which was the accelerator that was really there to help bring entrepreneurs to Korea, to Asia, to basically help them get off the ground, and using Korea as sort of a test bed for starting up versus maybe going to China or somewhere else where there's more restrictions. But regarding today's talk, I wanted to give a more color on the sort of the current startup scene in Korea, because I do work with a lot of startups these days, and have been since about 2013 or so, and how much it's evolved really a lot. I mean, like culturally, I'd say back then, call it late 2009, 2010, there was a lot of fear of failure. Doing a startup or not working with a large conglomerate, leaving school, going to a Samsung or a Hyundai was sort of the thing to do, not starting something new and going into debt immediately. And a lot of them were considered too risky, and therefore funding was really difficult to come by, and unless you had sort of, call it, very draconian terms. And in venture a few years ago, basically loans were personal, the founders were personally liable for these loans that they would get from these VCs or investors. But since then, it's come a long way, and I think now it's a lot easier to get funding in Korea. But probably the bigger shadow was the chaebol companies, the big conglomerates in Korea that had many advantages, basically monopolizing all the different areas of services and technology, and you either acquired or you got killed by them, or they made it very difficult for you to function. But since then, I'd say there's been a huge resurgence. Namely, I'd say in credit to the Korean government, the Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprise and other government branches have really encouraged the growth of startups and VC capital, by funding more funds and accelerators. And so, I think 2019 they're pegged around $2.3 billion startup funding, which is about a 30% increase in the year before. And venture fund formation in Korea had probably about a 20% boost from around the same time period. And if you look at the areas of investment, I'd say the top three are probably biotech, IT, services, in that range. And I'll go over some of these Korean unicorns that I've experienced from seeing them in Korea. So the growth, I'd say, of the scale of venture investments in Korea is also making an impact on bigger funds. So they're seeing unicorn companies emerging, and they're saying, great, we should double down. We should also invite U.S. investors into the game as well. So now I'd say Korea is probably ranked about 5th globally for homegrown unicorns coming out of any one country. Private investors, corporate venture like SK Telecom, they're also much more active than they were before. And the government's also creating these better tax environments. So corps can invest and see some benefit, especially in more early stage investment where it's usually very risky. So just a brief overview of some of the big unicorns that have come out of there in the last 5 years. So Coupang, founded in 2010, valuation is around 10 billion, I'd say now. But it wasn't until Sequoia and BlackRock put money in the later rounds that it really got on the map, and people were saying, wow, okay, maybe it's not a U.S. company or going to the U.S. yet, but e-commerce is huge. GDP, all that is sort of in big numbers in Korea. So we can see it scaling and putting enough money to work there that we'll get a big return. Bluehole, which owns PUBG, which is one of the biggest game companies that are out there. It's about 5 billion, and they got an investment from Tencent. So China also looking at Korea for growth. And then I would say probably the third is cosmetics. LNP Cosmetics, which owns, you've probably seen a lot of these face masks that women wear. Well, they've sold about a billion of those so far, and they're worth about 1.8 billion valuation. But what's been sort of a byproduct of all that is this emergence of Korea funded funds in the US that invest in the Korean American or Korean founders. So the Korean government is saying, hey, why don't you look abroad and find other startups that want to go to the US? And to your point about expanding internationally, I think for a lot of startups, they don't have either the bandwidth or the money, and just focusing and sort of on their, the first year being more of a domestic company, and then with more dry powder going overseas, and having the right connections, having the right strategic investors to bring them there. We're seeing funds emerge in the U.S. There's two that I know very well. One is Access Ventures, the other is Primer, and they focus primarily Korean, but also on U.S. companies that have some sort of Korean element, whether it's a Korean founder or an equity stake from a Korean citizen at a certain percentage. And that's really just to bring more job growth into Korea, but also to help boost these founders who are abroad and trying to make their company work in the U.S. And I think it's been a pretty interesting combination. It's created more, also, I would say, curiosity from traditional sandhill investors who normally wouldn't look at overseas companies and saying, hey, there's some great ones that have have shown good track record in Korea. So I think we're going to double down on that particular area. So I'd say comparatively, Chinese funds have been doing this for some time. Looking at raising money in the U.S. and bringing it overseas to invest in great Chinese companies like GSR and some others. And Koreans are sort of following that model in many ways, but also just trying to be very hyper local, with the Korean government getting involved in investments, both on the fund side and also on the direct investment side in Korea. So this is kind of an overview in the U.S. Some of the more recent companies that have crossed over, like Mimi Box is a beauty company that does sort of a subscription model for that, and there's others, but sort of the top areas I would say probably around gaming, entertainment, content, beauty, and probably OLED electronics and these more traditional areas.
Okay, thanks, David.
Sure.
Quick question for you from the audience. Do you see the role of government in Korea as basically positive, or is this kind of are there negatives about it?
Well, initially, they were pushing a lot of the startup accelerator and fund of funds development in Korea. It was less private money, but unfortunately, with that came a lot of rules, that you had to follow. And but a lot of startups I know, got their second life because they were able to get a check from the government, and didn't have to go with being personally liable. They're a little bit more lenient. They're also matching funds, which if the government put in money and another investor put in money, they would sort of double that amount just to encourage more of this. So I'd say in the beginning, people were, cautiously optimistic, but as time has gone on and there's been this emergence of unicorns, I think now that more private money is there, I think there's less of a sort of shadow of government being involved in investments, and some of them, and not really being a spokesperson for them at all. Some of these government agencies, take a very passive role. They don't take a board seat. Even if they own a much larger stake, they could sell it back to one of the investors that's in the round with them. So they've come up with these different tools to make it seem founder friendly. I mean, they're really trying to be, but I understand, if it's a business that, the government can scrutinize, people may be a little bit more, cautious about it. But I think it helped kickstart things. But now, thanks to that, there's a lot of more private money going into it.
Okay, thanks. And following up for Bob and for Ed, what about the role of big companies? This is also really a question from the audience, and it really has to do with the nature of collaborations between big companies and startups. Certainly, a lot of the big companies are here trying to do corporate venture capital in Silicon Valley, but what about working with startups at home? Bob, why don't you take it first?
Sure, man. It's a really interesting thing. There's two things that are interrelated here. Number one, do big companies serve as the locus of knowledge spillovers that new companies can use? And there's a lot of thought about that, and that's the CVC example. Data tends to suggest that that's probably a bit limited because companies rarely start seeking knowledge. Almost every company that starts thinks they know everything, and has, and basically it's usually not an exercise of looking for something, or they quickly fail. But that does not say big companies are important. They're incredibly important. They're important as customers. Wherever we find a great deal of purchasing and it's robust economic activity, particularly among big companies, we find a lot of small companies starting to satisfy the demand. A lot of times the big companies have traditional suppliers that can't satisfy them when they're growing. They can't respond as quickly to market changes. And as the big companies can't respond as quickly as the small companies. So in a robust economy where big companies are doing well, also the small companies and new companies will do because of the business and the markets they'll get. That's why Japan tends to have a robust system. The big companies are big customers to the entrepreneurial firms.
But let me kind of throw this back at you.
Sure.
I think here in the Valley, one of the reasons that Japanese companies are doing CVC is because that may be necessary in order to get the startup companies to be willing to even look at them to do business.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on there in that question. It's a really deep question, Richard, and we could probably spend an hour on it. Why they believe that is interesting and what they're actually looking for. CVC in its classic form is, supporting a company and then buying it if they successfully developed the technology. And of course, the company benefits and the big company develops by acquiring the knowledge. At the new model, comparing it to, say, the model in the 70s where you had Bell Labs or, large companies would develop in-house. Now we take a more tournament approach where we'll fund 5 or 6 companies and the one that succeeds will buy. The social effect is that that's great for the one company that succeeds. For the 4 that don't, they go home and live with mom and dad for another few years. So I'm not sure, it's just a very complex thing. And you're right, and it's part of the new world we're heading towards.
Yeah, but one of the interesting things that I noticed both in your presentation and in Ed's presentation is that a lot of the venture capital that's invested in Japan and in Thailand is really corporate venture capital.
No, I think that's
a relatively, compared to the US where it's maybe 25 or 30%, it's more like 75 or 80% in these other countries.
That's precisely right. The traditional venture capital model that we see here in Silicon Valley isn't that amenable to Japan's environment. I mean, you're not going to get liquidity in 7 years in Japan. It takes longer. The type of companies that are founded aren't the types that are quick flips.
Yet, very few companies in Japan exit by being acquired.
Right, and well, because so the whole thing is going on that what we're finding in Japan is just a different environment. It's not to say it's unsuccessful. It employs lots of people. Japan's economy is quite robust and has lots of employment. It's just it's different, and to apply the model of the United States to Japan is limited. It's important.
Well, that's our whole topic today.
It's important to point out it's important to point out the other thing, this idea of unicorns. Unicorns in the United States and compare them in Japan or other places, to me, seems not very useful. Unicorns are true in the United States because of stupid overvaluations. I mean, there are firms out there that are getting valuations more than Toyota, that have two lines, I'm being deliberately provocative, but, they have just a little line of code. We're kind of silly in the United States, the valuations we give some firms, and Japan may just be the sane one.
Yeah, okay. We'll come back to unicorns in a minute. First of all, Ed, you've got a lot of CVC in Thailand, and you have the big corporates who are kind of, have a major role in market access and so forth. Are you seeing a lot of POC relationships as well as corporate venture capital with startup companies, or are they relatively hands-off?
POC, sorry, Richard.
Proof of concept, where a big company will ask a startup to do some sort of a test case.
Yeah, so the corporate is driving everything at the moment at the VC part and some of the activities that I was showing you on the slides. But let me add a couple other things that didn't show up on those slides. So there's another role which would be like proof of concept, but it wouldn't be proof of concept necessarily for a technology. I'll start my video. Okay, I don't know if you're gonna be able to see me because I'm backlit, but you can look out my window. So let me give a much more mundane version of proof of concept, and that is the company called CP All. CP is one of Thailand's largest companies, if not Thailand's largest company, and they own a company called CP All, which owns the 7-Eleven franchise in Thailand. I think I've read somewhere that it's second only to Japan in a number of stores, but I really can't believe that. I gotta believe it's bigger than Japan because there are 7-Elevens everywhere in Thailand, and Thailand's a big country. So I don't know the actual number, but the point is 7-Eleven is a very, very important business to this company, CP All. And CP All does an excellent job running 7-Eleven. I think they're the greatest 7-Elevens in the world with the measure of 7-Elevens. I'm not going beyond that, but if you were measuring 7-Elevens, I think they would be right up there. So for example, CP All runs all kinds of small entrepreneurial contests for people who are bringing out new snack foods. So one of my former students has come up with a salmon sushi, a salmon sausage. So he's, beef is not heavily eaten in Southeast Asia. A lot of people are trying to eat less meat in general, and fish is always a desired alternative. So he's come up with a great tasting salmon sausage that he is now, CPO opens up a product search, and then if you win, they help you develop it, and then you get it into all their stores, which is something like 15,000 stores across the country. So that's not proof of concept in the deep technology sense, but it is a way of bringing new products to market for these bigger companies. So that's on one side, bringing new products to market. Then there's the middle side, the part that I focused on in the slides, which is really corporates helping startups get started in complementary businesses, the payment gateways, the logistics, delivery, and stuff like that. There's a third group as well, which it's my belief has not done quite so well, but this is more anecdotal, and I wouldn't necessarily share any direct stories anyway, because they're usually painful stories. But let's just say one of the things that Silicon Valley has when it comes to venture capital is they have venture capitalists who've learned venture capital from the ground up. And I think there's some knowledge base there that is not translated very well to people like SoftBank, for example. SoftBank drove a lot of the valuation that Bob was talking about single-handedly. And I know of some corporates in the region, we'll just say in the region, who wanted to get into some more technology-based investments, and that hasn't gone as well. It doesn't, so anytime I see a situation, even in the US, if I see a situation like Terranos or WeWork or something where there's not much San Francisco money, I begin to worry that somebody, okay, they're meant to be smart money, they're meant to be, sophisticated investor, but I do have a belief that the tacit knowledge in Silicon Valley when it comes to venture investing is probably second to none for that.
Okay, Ed, your answer really kind of, again, comes back to the heart of the question today. What is it in Silicon Valley, and can it be applied to other places? Is there any ideas on what you see as the kind of ground up knowledge of the smart money here that's not there yet?
Well, I'm an old timer now, unfortunately, although maybe not quite on this panel, but an older timer, let's say. The original venture capitalists were technologists, and when an entrepreneur came to them with an idea, they knew more about that idea than the entrepreneur did. They knew more about the industry than the entrepreneur did. They knew more about who the customers were going to be, who the suppliers are going to be. They could lay a path to market as well or better than the entrepreneur. And that is something that's really, really hard to build. And that's actually one of my messages when I'm talking to corporates. This is not a message that comes through very clearly because many of the corporates are awash of dreams of finding the next Uber. But I try to explain that the original San Francisco money in Uber was putting money in when the company didn't have any cars. They had just an iPhone license and a dream and some very modest goals. Their goals were something like, we're going to buy 10 cars. And if we get big, it'll be $1 billion company. But I don't know any investor outside of San Francisco. I don't even know an investor really like this in Boston. I think Boston even kind of can't put that kind of vision together to say, this kid who has got this idea and I think we can make it work. What happens after that, well into the later rounds with the inflated valuations and stuff like that is a completely different story. But I'm talking about the early investors who are really technology people and can kind of see the vision even better than the entrepreneur. That's hard to replicate.
Okay. David, can I ask you for your comments on this? Let's go back and start with the big corporates in Korea. Are the big chaebol really kind of blocking growth for the startups, or are they really starting to be a positive impact?
Well, I'd say initially they were definitely, the 800-pound gorilla that they always had to deal with in any kind of business that they would try to start there. But I'd say they've come a long way. If you look at the accelerator that we did with K Startup, and thankfully you were one of our advisors. When SK put money into that thing along with Google, I mean, we were a nonprofit, but at the same time, there were corporate mandates they both had, but you could see the differences between what an SK wanted and what a Google wanted. Google really wanted to just get into the region softly and provide things for developers. Eventually, trying to sell their own cloud services and these different things. Whereas I'd say the SK really wanted to promote their own entrepreneurs and build up the ecosystem and eventually identify someone less from a fiduciary perspective and more from a hey we can grow this and we can be a customer or something. I think that was the thinking. So I think depends who's running the show and what sort of timeline they're in terms of investment. But for a lot of startup companies, having a corporate customer is super important because if it's not NRE and it's some other way of making money from these guys, it's really their first check they get. Sort of developing these projects for them while they're figuring out their business model and trying to scale it in a more traditional VC sense. So I'd say in that sense, Korean chaebols have been positive, mixed reviews in the beginning. These days, a little bit more positive. You look at Samsung, they've got a number of different funds in the Valley that are trying to do even non-strategic investments that are just crazy ideas that, may make money later on, all the way to, does it really, integrate into their core businesses? So I view it from both sides, being on both sides of the fence myself. But if I meet a startup and they're like, hey, our first check is coming from XYZ corporation, we're doing a project, for them. They're also taking some equity. Is that okay? I would say that's great, but what is your long-term vision? Do you really need these guys, or is it a way to test, your MVP and see how it does in terms of making money or scaling or something like that? So it's different for everybody, but as it gets more competitive out there for startups to prove themselves, to hit a certain milestone with investors, I think that there's, they're just looking for different ways to, to monetize.
Okay, thanks. I want to throw a question to everybody that's coming from the audience, and this is about exit. And there are various different patterns in exits that you see in different Asian countries versus here in Silicon Valley. And I wonder what kind of impact the sort of lower barriers to IPO that you see in some countries, such as Mother's stock market in Japan, where exits typically are really no bigger than Series C VC here in the US a lot. What kind of impact do you see that having on the system as a whole? Bob, why don't you start? We'll go Bob, Ed, and David quick.
Sure, it's work. As you know, I published a paper on this 2 years ago. We looked at, just to summarize the results, we looked really hard on the development of Mothers and JASDAQ and the other various exchanges in Japan that were intended to encourage the formation of money for technology firms by giving them a route to exit that was easier to obtain than being around for 15 years and having certain multiples that were thought to be difficult. The net result of it was that the money from investors started funding a lot of poor companies. And the companies didn't, and the failure rate of those companies that got funded up went very high. And so what happened is that because it was ready, they redirected money away from other stuff that may have taken longer to develop, and we got a higher bad company rate, if you will, in Japan. And so the overall performance of technology firms fell down with the introduction of those exchanges. That result maybe you think may be unique to Japan, but it turns out it happened same in the United States when we passed the Jobs Act, which made it much easier to go public and not disclose. A bunch of miserable companies were funded that failed badly, and so the whole point is those high requirements are there for a reason. And one needs to think about it. Sure, it's easier to fly. It's cheaper and easier to fly an airplane by just putting on autopilot and having a 14-year-old in front. But maybe there's a reason why we want an experienced aviator up there. So it gets to the same point, and I think that's true around the world. We have to be careful what policies we use to encourage technology firms, because you want to encourage good companies. You don't want to fund a lot of bad ones. And you don't need additional churn. Churn is an unfortunate thing to have, not a good thing. And, it's necessary and it's around, but we need to think about this more carefully than we do when we do these things.
Well, kind of conversely, do you think that having this sort of hypervaluations and unicorns mean that we should make IPO even stricter?
Yeah, in my personal view, absolutely. We have valuations now, which there's no way to explain them other than, not recently valuations have changed in the past 2 months, but assuming before that, there's no way to explain like the valuation that Slack got by anything other than sheer speculation. There's just no way to explain it. And it's because people can realize that value in the financial markets doesn't mean they're realizing value in the world's markets where products are made and people buy and sell things for real. So I think it shifts the focus of the game from building good, solid companies into building financial flashes. And you got to think about it. Think of Instagram. I don't know, what did it have, 5 total employees? And went out for a bazillion dollars. And I don't know the social value of sharing a picture, but I don't know if it was that much. So the point is that when we think we open these routes, they become less about funding really solid, good companies that are going to grow with solid valuations rather than more to the inflated valuations.
But
So
this principle applies everywhere. This is not specific to any particular quote, model of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, well, we found that in Japan. We found the results consistent in Japan, Korea, and the United States.
Okay, Ed, how do you see the situation with going public in the markets you're familiar with, Thailand and other places in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so I will make a comparison back to the U.S. And again, I want to emphasize my own particular bias is coming from the point of view of technology and innovation development, not business creation or wealth creation. So with that bias, these high IPOs set also, in addition to the things that Bob was just saying, set unfair expectations on regular old companies that are doing good stuff. And that's the problem I see. So if there's a lower threshold for IPOs, okay, maybe it would finance poor companies. I could see that happening, as Bob said. But my other concern would be, they would be less innovative companies. So you might get poor companies on one side that don't work, but you would probably also get a whole bunch of other companies on the other side, which are more sure bets and therefore less innovative. So that's my other concern with a lower bar to IPO.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that. I'm reminded that when you have large companies that are real powerhouses, startup companies have to be more innovative in order to get into the market in the first place. And this is one of the things that tends to, they create a zone of death around them, if you would. And I think that's also been positive in the Valley and kind of less attended to in places where it's a newer system.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And in fact, back on the corporate side, so Bob was talking about Instagram, I think a lot of people also from outside Silicon Valley and certainly outside the US, misrecognize the fact that a lot of companies exist just to be bought by Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. So, and that's not a new model, by the way. That's what existed in biotech for a long, long time. So there's a lot of reasons people start companies.
David, what's your impression with regard to exits and conditions of exit in Korea?
Well, generally speaking, most companies there want to go, to NASDAQ, to the U.S. capital markets because, it's bigger. Although the requirements are a little higher than the lower requirements on KOSDAQ or the local stock exchanges in Korea. So most do not, that I've seen, at least the bigger ones, have a desire to go there. But I'm an early stage investor, so very few of my companies make it that far. Most of them are acquired at a much earlier stage to the companies that Ed just mentioned. And so I look at it from that perspective. But for the ones that are sort of in that range, and there are a few that are sort of gearing to go public soon, obviously they're all American companies, right? And they're either founded here or they were incorporated at some point in the US because the investors kind of saw that. But, unless you have the growth that's there or the potential to scale it larger, or you can identify how you can get into the US or global market, they don't even bother, coming. I think it's really, knowing what your strengths are and being able to sort of capitalize on the local market. And if it means going public, then great. But the majority of the ones I see, IPO is a pipe dream. And I think, most of the reality of these early stage companies is acquisition at an earlier stage.
Okay. Today, we've talked about keeping this, quote, standard model of Silicon Valley in context and recognizing that there's an awful lot of startup companies that never see a penny of venture capital, and that there are other models for success. We also talked about the importance of starting out with a good local proposition and really having something that will really be driven by problem solving in kind of a local market context, and then having the vision to expand, to go global. We've talked about the roles of big companies. We've talked about the roles of government. We've talked about kind of attitudes toward exit. I want to end by asking each panelist to comment briefly on where do you see this going? Do you see disillusionment with the Silicon Valley model hitting these Asia markets, considering the fact that it's kind of not necessarily as universal as people in Silicon Valley tend to think? David, what do you think? Will people become disillusioned with the Valley?
Well, I think you're seeing local, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but in Korea, what I'm seeing is like a hybrid version of local and what works best in the Valley. I remember when Social Media, that movie came out, I saw so many entrepreneurs with that like Blu-ray, like in their bookshelf next to, Lean Startup and these other things, where they thought that was, reality of a contemporary startup and how you approach it and, the dreams they have around creating a great company. But the reality is, it doesn't always end that way. And you have to incorporate what works for you locally, as well as what can work in Silicon Valley. It's a different country, it's a different region. Yes, it's a mix of different cultures, but you have the best people in the world working in one place. And if you can't adapt to that and know the right people who can help you adapt, I think that's you have to know your limitations early. So I'd say I'm seeing more hybrid models come out. One of the interesting examples is, I'm an LP in Y Combinator, one of the accelerators here, and one of the interesting things that has come out of that is a really forward way for entrepreneurs to think when they're raising money, whether it's a safe note that they've coined themselves, or even how entrepreneurs interview their investors, where that's flip-flopped, where before we would meet entrepreneurs and grill these guys, but now they're grilling us and saying, why am I letting you into the round? And what strategic value do you add to my company? And I see now more and more entrepreneurs overseas doing the same thing too, where they're adopting the same principles, where they're trying to flip the whole cultural switch there. So investors are seeing that really the founders have the power and they could always get money offshore. They don't have to go to local guys. So they're having to abide by it. But again, I don't know how long that's going to last. I think, if the results of exits and multiples don't come in, then ultimately that will, shape the way that companies are founded and all the cultural around that as well.
Okay, thanks. Ed, what do you think? Will Silicon Valley be the cause of disillusionment?
No, to be honest, I don't think Silicon Valley is primarily influential in terms of stories, and the government latches on to things, and it's a great source of quotations for workspaces and stuff like that. But our economic forces are China, Asia, Japan, and the corporates that are based in the region. The Silicon Valley model is out there in force in stories and talks, but economically the money is from Asia.
Okay, that's very interesting. Bob, what do you think? Will people become disillusioned with the Valley? Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Oh, I got it now. Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, it's hard to say, really. I think one indication, of course, is I think all of us here at Stanford know there's a big push at the end of the fall, a pushback against technical training. And there was a big push. Look, a lot of us want to study art. We don't want to study apps. And that was a great deal there was a nice discussion in the newspaper here, as you know, and it's kind of interesting to see that happening. Let me, for you, focus the comments about your question in Japan, so we can think about it that way. Japan, I think, has gotten tired of pushing on this string. They've been doing entrepreneurship promotion Silicon Valley style for at least 25 years, at least that I'm aware of. And when we had a conference about this in Stanford about 10 years ago, which you were at, we discovered that they were pushing and promoting entrepreneurship, technical entrepreneurship, small companies, at the rate of about $30 billion a year when you summed up all the efforts. And that's about the size of the American VC industry for an economy a third the size of the United States. When I talk to investors in Japan, and I do a lot, in fact, last night, and I think they have gotten to the point that, number one, they haven't really changed the dial by doing all that. So they might as well, you know, it's almost a retreat from the West a bit. There's still a lingering, you know, we have to learn something, but it's very much feeling, let's do our own thing. And the second thing that's really happening, it's happening here in the United States. I suspect other places, but I don't have my expertise there. A new generation is now 20 years old. You know, and these people have much different views of the world than people that are now 40, and much different worlds of the people in the world who are now 60, like you and me, Richard. So, you know, the point is that what was sexy to the person who is now 40 is no longer sexy to the person who is now 20. And many of them are focused on what is the world like and how am I going to make my way in it. And they're asking questions of inequality. And
just to clarify, you're thinking about people who are more socially, young people are really driven by a need to really have a good positive impact on the world rather than becoming personally successful.
And they don't really see that in business anymore. As you know, both in Japan and the United States, people under 25 have moved sharply politically left, in some cases radically so. And this is not the forum for that, but the point is their dreams are maybe not ours about technical entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And so I think we're passing the torch, and we need to be aware of that when we think about what we want to push and promote.
Thank you. Those are great comments. I'm afraid we have to end our session. I want to thank everybody for participating. It's been a real privilege to see that we've got a worldwide audience and a lot of names on the attendee list that I recognize. Welcome today. We'll try to do a program like this again before too long. First of all, please join me in thanking our panelists. And let me say this was a great session. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.